The wind carried the scent of pine trees when Oconostota spotted the familiar silhouette riding along the trail that led to the river. Her dark eyes followed every movement of the white rider, every curve of the body she knew so well, every gesture she had learned to decipher in the secret nights by the whispering waters. The young Cherokee pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her heart race like a war drum as she walked toward what could be their last meeting. The afternoon shadows stretched between the trees, creating a cloak of discretion she believed sufficient to protect their forbidden love. The man dismounted near the bank, his fair hair gleaming under the last rays of sun, and she ran to him with the urgency of one who knows each moment together was stolen from fate. In his arms, Oconostota forgot the ancestral laws that governed her people, the invisible barriers that separated two races condemned to conflict. William was different from the other white men she had known. His blue eyes carried not the hardness of conquest, but the tenderness of one who saw beyond skin color. He spoke a few words in Cherokee, pronounced with touching effort, and she smiled as she taught him the secrets of her language while he shared stories of distant lands. There, in the intimacy created by nature, they built their own world where no borders or prejudices existed. The river silently witnessed their encounters, reflecting in its waters the love that defied all conventions. When they parted, she carried with her his foreign scent impregnated on her skin, and he kept on his lips the wild taste of freedom that only she could offer. That afternoon, however, something different hung in the air. Oconostota noticed an unusual tension in William's muscles, a restlessness he tried to disguise with more intense caresses. He spoke of rumors circulating among the soldiers, of orders arriving from afar, of an uncertain future approaching like an inevitable storm. She didn't fully understand his words in English, but perfectly understood the tone of farewell they carried. Her chest contracted with a pain she couldn't name, a premonition that made her bones ache as if sensing winter's approach. They made love with the intensity of the condemned, each touch charged with desperate urgency, each kiss sealed with the certainty that time was running out. The sound of approaching hooves should have been a warning, but they were too lost in each other to perceive the danger drawing near. When they finally heard the furious voices echoing through the trees, it was too late to flee. Oconostota saw terror in William's eyes at the same time she recognized her uncle's implacable voice, the elder Atakulakula cutting through the air like a sharp blade. The group of Cherokee warriors emerged from the forest like vengeful shadows, their faces painted not for war, but for the tribal justice about to be executed. The young white man tried to place himself between her and the armed men, a noble gesture that only intensified the Cherokee's fury at the invaders' audacity. Oconostota felt the world collapse when she realized there was no going back. Their secret love had been discovered and the consequences would be irreversible. The humiliation burned stronger than fear when she was dragged back to the village, the rough hands of warriors gripping her arms with enough force to leave marks. William shouted her name in his language, a desperate sound that echoed through the forest like the last breath of an era coming to an end. She didn't dare look back, but carried with her the image of him being restrained by soldiers who appeared as if they had been waiting for that moment. The walk to the village was made in absolute silence, broken only by the sound of feet on dry leaves and the heavy breathing of the men escorting her. Each step took her further from William and closer to the judgment that would seal her fate. The sky began to darken, and with it faded the last hopes that this was merely a nightmare from which she could awaken. The village's central fire crackled with an intensity that seemed to reflect the elders' wrath gathered in a circle. Oconostota was pushed to the center of the sacred space, her knees touching the earth she had walked since childhood, now transformed into the stage of her condemnation. The heavy silence was broken only by the crackling of flames and the low murmur of women clustering in the shadows, their expressions mixed with horror and compassion. Atakulakula rose slowly, his imposing figure casting a shadow that engulfed the young woman kneeling before him. His eyes, which had once shone with paternal pride, now reflected only the bitter disappointment of one who saw his expectations shattered by blood's betrayal. The elder's voice cut through the air like a sharp axe, each word carrying the weight of generations of tradition she had stained with her unworthy conduct. The accusations fell upon her like stones, each heavier than the last. She had dishonored not only her family, but the entire tribe by giving herself to a white man, to the enemy who came taking their lands and destroying their way of life. The elder spoke of the purity she had lost, the trust she had broken, the dangerous example she had set for other young women in the village. Oconostota kept her eyes fixed on the ground, feeling the weight of every gaze that judged her, every whisper that condemned her choices. Her tears fell silently on the earth, mixing with the dust that would soon cover her tracks when she was banished forever. Her heart beat so hard it seemed to want to leap from her chest, carrying with it all the pain of a love that had become her ruin. When Atakulakula pronounced the sentence of exile, the world seemed to stop for an instant. The fire's flames wavered, as if even the fire hesitated before the punishment's severity. She could never again step on that land, never again be recognized as a daughter of the Cherokee tribe, never again have a home to which she could return. Her name would be erased from oral records, her achievements forgotten, her existence denied as if she had never been born. The physical pain of being rejected by her own people was greater than any wound she could suffer in battle. Oconostota raised her eyes for the first time since the trial began, meeting her uncle's implacable gaze who had become her executioner. In those eyes, she saw not only anger, but a deep sadness that perhaps mirrored her own. Among the faces in the crowd, one stood out for its absence of condemnation. Tsiyu observed the scene with a different intensity, his fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tense in a way she recognized well. The young warrior had asked for her hand in marriage 3 moons ago, a proposal she had gently refused, without revealing the true reasons. Now he knew why her words of love had found only silence, why his gifts had been accepted with courtesy, but without enthusiasm. The pain in his eyes was almost unbearable to contemplate, a mixture of rejected love and wounded loyalty that made her heart bleed even more. Tsiyu didn't look away when she met his gaze, and in that silent moment passed between them a communication that dispensed with words. He understood her choice, even if he couldn't forgive it. When she was ordered to leave before dawn, Oconostota rose with a dignity that surprised even her accusers. She didn't beg for clemency, nor try to justify her actions. She accepted the punishment as a warrior accepts a battle wound, with courage and without complaints. The walk to her cabin was made in absolute silence, each step echoing like a funeral drum through the paths she knew by heart. The other women stepped away from her passage as if she carried a contagious curse, but a few whispered farewell words so low that only the wind could hear them. She gathered her few belongings with hands that trembled imperceptibly, each object carrying memories of a life about to become merely a remembrance. The night would be long, and with the first ray of sun would come the moment to leave behind everything she had known and loved. The morning dew covered the grass like tears from the earth itself when Oconostota crossed the village boundaries for the last time. Her footprints left deep marks in the moist soil, traces that would be erased by the first rain, just as her memory would be erased from her people's hearts. She carried only a small leather pouch with some dried roots, a handful of seeds, and the knife she had received in her coming-of-age ceremony. Bitter irony, as now she would use this blade to survive alone in the wild vastness. The forest's silence was broken only by the sound of her steps on dry leaves and the melancholic song of birds greeting the dawn. Each tree she passed seemed an old friend saying goodbye. Each familiar stone became a memory that would soon be lost in time's mist. The morning cold penetrated through her simple tunic, but it was nothing compared to the ice that had settled in her heart. For 3 days she walked without certain destination, following animal trails and watercourses that led her ever farther from everything she knew. Hunger began to grip her stomach on the 2nd day, but the thirst for freedom was even greater. For the first time in her life, every decision was entirely hers, every step taken by her own will. She learned to read the forest signs with survivor's eyes, identifying edible plants, finding shelter in natural caves, making fire with dry twigs when the sun set. The nights were the hardest, when absolute silence made the village voices echo in her mind, the laughter of other young women, the sound of drums on celebration nights. She cried then, allowing herself this weakness only in darkness, when there were no witnesses to her pain. But each dawn she rose stronger, molded by adversity as iron is molded by fire. It was on the fourth day that she saw him for the first time. Tsiyu emerged from the forest like a ghost, his silent movements of an experienced hunter, unable to completely disguise his presence from someone who had learned to read every shadow and movement in the woods. He maintained a respectful distance, never approaching close enough to be considered a threat, but always present like a protective shadow. Oconostota pretended not to notice his vigilance, but her heart warmed, knowing she wasn't completely alone in the world. During the day, she occasionally found small gifts left on her path: fresh wild fruits, clean water in leaf containers, dry wood arranged near where she had spent the night. He cared for her from a distance, respecting her exile but refusing to abandon her completely. His invisible presence became her only connection to the life she had lost. A week passed before she finally turned and looked directly at the place where she knew he was hidden. Tsiyu emerged from the shadows slowly, his hands empty and open in a sign of peace, his face marked by a determination she had never seen before. They stared at each other across the clearing, two wounded hearts recognizing each other's pain without need for words. He had disobeyed the elders' orders by following her, risking his own position in the tribe for a woman who had rejected his love. The courage of this gesture touched something deep in her soul, a gratitude mixed with even greater guilt for having caused so much suffering to someone who deserved nothing but happiness. Tsiyu approached slowly, each step measured and careful, until he was close enough for her to see the unshed tears shining in his dark eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse with contained emotion and sleepless nights. He had decided to share her exile, renounce everything he knew so she wouldn't face alone the dangers of wildlife. Oconostota felt her heart break hearing those words. His love was pure and generous. Everything hers had been selfish and destructive. She shook her head slowly, explaining with gestures and whispered words that he couldn't sacrifice his life for her, that his tribe needed warriors like him, that true love sometimes meant letting go. But Tsiyu only smiled with infinite sadness, saying that a warrior without honor had no value to any tribe, and that he had lost his honor the moment he couldn't protect the woman he loved. The decision was made. He would be her companion in exile, her protector on the uncertain journey that awaited them. The improvised camp they established near a small stream became the first home Oconostota knew outside the village. Tsiyu demonstrated impressive skill in transforming the wild nature into safe shelter, building a small but solid cabin with interwoven branches and mud, creating ingenious traps that guaranteed regular food, identifying medicinal plants that grew abundant in the region. She observed his every movement with a mixture of admiration and remorse, recognizing the extraordinary generosity of a man who had abandoned everything for unrequited love. The days organized into a simple but efficient routine. He hunted and she gathered, he repaired tools and she prepared meals. He stood guard during the night and she tended the sacred fire they always kept burning. Between them grew a partnership based on mutual necessity, but tempered by a silent tension neither dared mention. The first weeks brought challenges that tested not only their survival skills, but also the limits of their forced coexistence. Oconostota struggled against growing guilt for having dragged Tsiyu into that life of privations, while he struggled against the foolish hope that perhaps, with time, she might learn to love him the same way she had loved the white man. The silences between them became charged with unspoken words, glances that quickly looked away, gestures of care that carried more meaning than any declaration of love. She noticed how he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, the painful intensity in his eyes, when she woke screaming William's name during the nightmares that haunted her every night. His patience seemed infinite, but she knew that even the strongest hearts have their limits. One afternoon, while collecting medicinal herbs by the stream's edge, Oconostota discovered something that made her world stop again. The changes in her body, which she had attributed to exile stress and irregular eating, suddenly made sense with terrifying clarity. Her hands trembled when she touched her still, flat belly, but which would soon shelter the living proof of her forbidden love. William's child was growing inside her, a permanent connection to the man she had lost, but also a complication that could definitively destroy any chance of peace beside Tsiyu. She sat by the water's edge, watching her own reflection fragmented by the current's ripples, trying to find courage to face another impossible truth. How could she tell him? How could she ask him to accept not only sharing his life with another man's memory, but also caring for the child born of that love? The secret's weight became unbearable in the following days. Tsiyu noticed something had changed. She was quieter, more distant, refusing the food he offered and losing herself in thoughts that seemed to cause her physical pain. He questioned her gently about her well-being, offered herbal teas he knew for their calming properties, increased his care without asking direct questions. His genuine concern only intensified her torment, creating a vicious cycle of guilt and gratitude that threatened to suffocate her. One night, unable to bear the farce any longer, she almost confessed everything, but the words died in her throat when she saw the fragile hope that shone in his eyes whenever she showed any sign of affection. Revealing the pregnancy would be like driving a spear into the heart of the only man who had chosen to stay by her side when the whole world had abandoned her. The decision came to her in a moment of painful clarity, when she watched Tsiyu sleeping peacefully beside the almost extinguished fire. She couldn't continue lying to him, couldn't accept his sacrifices based on false hope of romantic reciprocity. Before the child began to grow visibly, before the truth became too obvious to be denied, she needed to leave again. This time, however, the journey would be even lonelier, carrying not only her own wounds, but also the responsibility for an innocent life that would depend entirely on her to survive. Oconostota spent the night awake, memorizing every detail of his face, recording in memory every gesture of kindness she had received, mentally preparing for another farewell that would break her heart into even smaller pieces. At dawn, when he awoke, he would find only the echo of her presence and a silent gratitude that would echo through the empty forest. The escape was executed with the precision of someone who had learned to survive in the shadows. Oconostota left before the first birdsong, leaving behind only carefully disguised footprints and the still warm fire that Tsiyu had fed during the night. She followed the stream's course for several miles, always stepping on stones to leave no tracks on the muddy bank, carrying only the essentials in a small bundle that wouldn't hinder her speed. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not only from physical effort, but from the certainty she was committing another betrayal against someone who deserved nothing but loyalty. Each step took her farther from the safety Tsiyu represented, but also freed her from the weight of living a lie that grew day by day. The forest swallowed her like a protective mother, offering 1,000 hiding places for a woman who had learned to become invisible when necessary. When the sun was high, she heard in the distance the sound she expected and feared, Tsiyu's desperate cry upon discovering her absence. The echo of her name being called crossed the woods like a blade, carrying such intense pain that she had to lean against a tree to keep from collapsing. He would search for her. She knew this, but she also knew her tracking skills surpassed his when it came to disappearing completely. The months beside the warrior had taught her everything he knew about survival, and now she would use this knowledge to protect him from the truth that would destroy him. Oconostota pressed her hand against her belly, whispering a silent promise to the child she carried. They would find a safe place, far from all those she had loved and lost, where they could build a new life without carrying the burden of past choices. The solitary journey stretched for weeks that became a constant struggle against the elements and her own growing weakness. The pregnancy began to take its toll. Morning sickness that left her unable to keep any food in her stomach, dizziness that made her stagger along the trails, a deep fatigue that transformed each mile traveled into a heroic conquest. She learned to sleep in trees to avoid predators, to find clean water following bird flight, to distinguish between nutritious and poisonous plants, even when hunger made her vision blur. Some nights, when loneliness became unbearable, she talked to the child in her womb, telling ancient stories her grandmother had taught her, singing Cherokee lullabies that echoed melancholically through the darkness. These one-sided conversations became her anchor to sanity, reminding her she wasn't completely alone in the world. It was during one of these lonely nights that she saw the fires in the distance, not the orange glow of a native camp, but the steady yellow light of lanterns indicating white settlers' presence. Her heart raced with a mixture of terror and impossible hope. Terror of being discovered and possibly killed by land invaders, hope that perhaps, just perhaps, she might find news of William among those men. Oconostota approached with the caution of an experienced hunter, crawling through undergrowth until she could observe the temporary military camp set up in a clearing. The soldiers moved with typical American Army discipline, their voices carrying familiar accents that made her heart leap. Among them, she desperately searched for a known silhouette, for fair hair that would shine in the flames, light, for a posture she would recognize even from afar. But William wasn't there, and the disappointment was so intense she had to bite her own hand to keep from groaning in pain. For 3 days, she observed the camp, learning the soldiers' routines, identifying moments of greatest distraction, gathering courage to approach. The need to know about William surpassed her self-preservation instinct. She needed to discover if he was alive, if he had thought of her, if he knew about the child she carried. On the 4th night, when most of the men slept and only 2 sentries stood guard near the perimeter, she finally moved. She slipped through shadows with the skill of someone born in the forest, approaching the youngest soldier who seemed less alert than his companion. When she emerged from darkness before him, the young man almost cried out in alarm, but she made a universal peace gesture, showing empty hands and whispering the few English words William had taught her. The soldier's eyes revealed not hostility, but cautious curiosity, and she knew she had found someone willing to listen to her impossible story. The young soldier, who introduced himself simply as Henry, possessed gentle eyes that vaguely reminded her of William's, awakening in her a dangerous but necessary trust. He led her away from the camp, to a small clearing where they could talk without waking his companions, their words mixed in fragmented English and expressive gestures that filled the language gaps. Oconostota told her story with the economy of one who had learned that certain truths were too dangerous to be completely revealed, mentioning only an encounter with a fair-haired, blue-eyed soldier, omitting the intimate details that could transform compassion into judgment. Henry listened in silence, his young face reflecting an understanding that went beyond words, recognizing in her vulnerability a humanity that many of his companions refused to see in native peoples. When she finally whispered William's name, the young man's eyes lit with recognition, and she knew she had found not just an informant, but perhaps the only remaining connection to the man she loved. The news Henry brought was like a blade driven into her already wounded chest. William had been transferred to a distant fort immediately after the incident that led to the discovery of their relationship. Military punishment for fraternizing with the enemy that could have cost much more if not for his impeccable reputation as a soldier. He had left without knowing about the pregnancy, carrying only the guilt for having exposed her to danger and the pain of an impossible love that had cost everything she had known. Henry spoke of nights when he had heard William murmur her name in restless dreams, of the deep sadness that had settled in his blue eyes like permanent fog, of letters he wrote but never sent, addressed to someone who had no address in the white world. The image of William suffering for her, alone in a distant fort, carrying the same pain that consumed her, made her tears fall freely for the first time since she had left the village. Henry promised to find a way to get a letter to William, but warned it would be dangerous for everyone involved if the correspondence were discovered. Oconostota spent the night mentally composing words she had never learned to write, trying to translate feelings too enormous for any language into simple phrases Henry could transcribe, how to explain that she carried his child, how to tell about the exile, the loneliness, the warrior who had sacrificed everything for her, how to say she loved him even more intensely now that he was lost forever. Henry patiently wrote every dictated word, his careful handwriting transforming her feelings into permanent marks on yellowed paper. The letter became a confession, a plea for forgiveness, a declaration of eternal love and a definitive farewell, all condensed into paragraphs that seemed insufficient to contain the enormity of her pain. When Henry left at dawn, taking with him the letter and a promise to try to obtain news about William's exact whereabouts, Oconostota found herself alone again in the forest's infinite vastness. But this time, loneliness carried a different quality. The fragile hope that her words might reach the man she loved, that he would know he hadn't been forgotten, that he would understand the circumstances that had separated them. She established a semi-permanent camp near a small lake, a location that offered clean water, abundant fish, and natural shelter in caves that dotted the surrounding hills. There she would wait for Henry's return, for news of William, for the growth of the child developing in her womb, transforming each day of waiting into a countdown to an uncertain future. The months that followed were a lesson in patience and resistance that tested all limits of her inner strength. Her belly grew round and heavy, transforming simple movements into monumental challenges, but also bringing unexpected joy when she felt the child's first movements. She constantly talked to the baby, telling stories about the brave father he or she would never know, about the proud tribe from which they had been banished, about the vast and dangerous world that awaited them beyond the mountains. Winter came early and harsh, forcing her to take refuge in one of the caves, where she spent long nights feeding a small fire and dreaming of arms that would warm her, familiar voices that would drive away loneliness's oppressive silence. Some mornings she woke certain she had heard her name being called by the wind, but always discovered it was only the echo of her own longing reverberating off the stone walls. Spring brought more than the thaw and the return of migratory birds. It brought Henry back, his worn boots leaving familiar footprints in the earth, still soft from the winter that had just passed. Oconostota spotted him when he was still just a distant point on the trail, but immediately recognized his posture and the way he carried his backpack, details she had memorized during their brief but intense coexistence months ago. Her heart raced when she noticed he carried something in his hands, a yellowed envelope that shone under the morning sun as if made of pure gold. She stood with difficulty, her already large belly hindering every movement, but anxiety gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Henry approached with the cautious smile of one who brings news that can either heal or completely destroy an already wounded soul. When he extended the letter, she held it with trembling hands, feeling through the paper the tangible presence of the man who had written those lines. William's words, patiently translated by Henry, fell upon her like rain on parched earth. He had received her letter, had cried learning about the child, had tried to desert 3 times to search for her before being placed under constant surveillance. He wrote about sleepless nights spent imagining the face of the child who would be born, about the pain of knowing she faced the forest's dangers alone, about desperate escape plans that were always frustrated by implacable military discipline. But there were also words of hope. He had been assigned to a reconnaissance mission that would take him through the mountains, a route that would pass near the region where she had established her refuge. If he could escape for a few hours without being detected, he would try to find her at the location she had described in her letter. The mentioned date was only 3 weeks in the future, enough time for her to prepare, but too short to contain the anxiety growing in her chest like a storm. Henry also brought news about Tsiyu, information obtained through an informal network of contacts between soldiers and traders who frequented frontier regions. The warrior had become a dark legend among his people, an obsessed man who continued searching for her despite the elders' orders to forget the exiled woman. He appeared periodically in the village, always thin and with wild eyes, asking for news that never came, offering himself for dangerous missions as if seeking the death he couldn't find. Some said he had lost his reason from wandering alone in the mountains so much. Others whispered he had made a blood oath that would only be fulfilled when he found her again. The image of Tsiyu transformed into a shadow of himself because of her added a new layer of guilt to the burden she already carried. 2 lives destroyed by her impossible love, 2 good men condemned to suffering because of her choices. The 3 weeks of waiting dragged like 3 years. Oconostota carefully prepared the meeting place, a clearing near the lake where she had spent the winter, decorating the space with wildflowers and creating discreet signals that would guide William to her without alerting possible pursuers. She practiced the words she would say, the gestures she would make, imagined 1,000 different scenarios for that moment that could be the last they would share together. The child inside her seemed to sense her agitation, moving constantly as if also anxiously awaiting the father's arrival. Some nights she dreamed that William arrived, embraced her, met the child, and took them away from that place of pain and separation. But she always woke alone in the cold cave, with only the echo of her own breathing and the baby's gentle movement to remind her she was alive. When she finally spotted the familiar silhouette emerging from the forest on the appointed date, Oconostota felt the world stop around her. William was thinner, his hair longer, a sparse beard covering the face she had kissed so many times in dreams, but his eyes remained the same, blue as summer sky, full of an intensity that made her heart race. They ran toward each other with the urgency of the condemned, and when he enveloped her in his arms, she felt that all the pain of months of separation was worth it for that moment of absolute completeness. His hands trembled when they touched her rounded belly, his eyes filled with tears when he felt the child's movement, and she knew that regardless of what the future held, those instants of pure happiness would be engraved in her soul forever. William whispered her name like a prayer, and she responded with kisses that carried months of accumulated longing. The hours they spent together were a microcosm of all the happiness they could have shared in an entire lifetime. William held her as if she were something too precious for this world, his hands carefully exploring the changes pregnancy had brought to her body, his lips whispering words of love in English that she understood perfectly through the emotion with which they were pronounced. They talked about the child who was coming, chose names that would honor both cultures, made impossible plans to flee to distant lands where they could live as a true family. He told about nights when he had contemplated definitive desertion, about maps he had secretly studied, looking for escape routes, about money he had managed to save by selling his few personal belongings. She described the months of loneliness, the cave that had become her home, the small milestones of the child's development she had felt alone. For a few precious hours, they existed in a world where love was enough to overcome any obstacle. But reality imposed itself when the sun began to incline westward. William needed to return before his absence was noticed, and both knew that encounter could be the last if he were discovered. They made love with the desperate intensity of those who know their living moments borrowed from fate, each caress charged with an urgency that dispensed with words. When the time for farewell came, neither could let go of the other. He kissed her tears while she clutched his uniform as if she could prevent him from leaving through sheer willpower. William promised to find a way to officially desert, to come for her before the child was born, to build a new life far from war and the prejudices that separated them. Oconostota nodded through tears, but deep in her heart knew she was hearing the words of a desperate man, not the plans of someone who truly believed in their viability. He disappeared into the forest, carrying a part of her soul, leaving her lonelier than she had ever felt. The days that followed were marked by a deep melancholy that not even the child's movements could completely alleviate. She relived every second of the encounter, every word exchanged, every touch shared, transforming memories into talismans against the loneliness that threatened to consume her. 2 weeks later, Henry appeared again, but this time his face carried the gravity of one who brings news he would prefer not to know. William had been discovered during his unauthorized absence, subjected to court-martial, and immediately transferred to a fort on the western frontier, a region so distant it might as well have been in another world. The punishment had been severe not only for desertion, but for the nature of his crime. Fraternizing with the enemy was considered treason in times of war. The contractions began 3 days after Henry's departure, arriving with an intensity that caught her off guard despite all her preparations. Alone in the cave that had become her sanctuary, Oconostota faced labor with the courage of a Cherokee warrior and the determination of a woman who knew she could only count on herself. The pains came in waves that seemed to want to split her body in half, but between them, she found strength to remember the stories her grandmother told about women who had given birth in even more difficult circumstances. When she finally held the child in her arms, a perfect girl with her dark eyes and William's fair hair, she felt that all losses and sacrifices had been worthwhile. The little one cried with surprising strength, announcing her arrival to the world with a vitality that promised resistance to face any adversity. Oconostota named her daughter Galilahi, a Cherokee word meaning attractive or lovely, but also carrying the connotation of something precious that must be protected at any cost. While the baby slept in her arms, she made a decision that had been forming in her heart since birth. She wouldn't raise her daughter in the forest's isolation, far from any human community. The girl deserved to know her people, her culture, her roots. even if it meant facing judgment and rejection again. Tsiyu still searched for her, still wandered the mountains like a lost spirit. Perhaps it was time to allow him to find her, to offer him the chance to be the father Galilahi would never know in William. Romantic love had cost her everything, but maternal love gave her strength to consider even greater sacrifices. When winter's first snows began to fall, she wrapped her daughter in soft furs and began the journey back to the Cherokee mountains, carrying the future in her arms and hope in her heart that love, in all its forms, could finally find a way to triumph over destiny. If you like this story, leave a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories.